So how the heck are you? Since last week, they're all full weeks. It was just a week or so ago. I was hosting the Martin Luther King breakfast for the Grand Rapids Urban League. I am their chair. It was a good event, and I'm very pleased of it, especially that the mayor, our current mayor, George Hartwell, was one of our featured speakers, and he came to me afterward, said, "Fred, I did you a favor, now I need one from you." And eager to serve, I said, "Well, Mr. Mayor, what can I do for you?" And he's asked me to do I believe it's the invocation for the State of the City address, which is coming up in a week or two. So sometimes, well, that's part of my theme today, is that when we serve others, we end up honoring ourselves, too. But if you don't already know, our chief executive at the Urban League is retiring this year, so we're going to be having to select a new leader, which is exciting and tiring and filled with a measure of uncertainty. My across-the-street neighbor announced this week that he was retiring. He's the president of Aquinas College, so we'll be sharing the adventure of transition. And likewise, as your senior minister, I'm preparing for welcoming Patrick Hamrick, our new executive minister, who will be here in the next 10 days and start working with us. Maybe you know that our music director, where did she go, was a featured soloist at the Park Church sequence of recitals all this month? And I couldn't go. I was at a meeting, so I hope someone here went. But our own congregation is hosting a series of organists next month in February, and so I hope you will make a few of those as well. Midday concerts, am I correct? Beautiful poster, I like that. And so on this very, very cold day, approaching the absolute dead center of winter, which is what we usually call which is that day called Groundhog's Day, that's the dead center of winter, I can begin to see a little light and a little warmth on the horizon. That even if the flowers are not beginning to come up and the trees are still clutched close, I can sense that there is more light. Have you noticed it? The sun is staying up a little later. And this week it'll get up a little earlier than 8 o'clock. Yes, the spring will be here. I'm filled with hope. Which reminds me of the Castro Camera Shop in San Francisco, the home of Harvey Milk's work, which is now being contested by two groups that want to own it. Sad outcome, but what Harvey Milk said in the midst of all of the other things he said was, you got to give him hope. What I try to do every week is to leave some vestige of hope. I'm not as gifted as Harvey. I am not as eloquent as Paul, which is why every week I have to ask for your help to proclaim the hope that we need. And so may these words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be found true in thy sight and in yours, thou who art my rock and my redeemer. All this month, Matthew and I are reminding each other and you and all of us of the disciplines of liberal religion. One of the stereotypes of the liberal, especially the liberal religious person, is, well, you don't have to believe anything, you don't have to do anything, you just lie around, goofing off spiritually. And I want to say, no, it's the most difficult path in religion because there is no handbook. There is no step-by-step instruction. We cook everything from scratch. We sew all our clothes by hand. We even grow the food and spin the thread. But there are things that we have to do in order to be true to our liberated calling. And we've named 4 of them. One of them is to worship, this hour that we spend together each week. Another is to study and learn, which we spoke about last week. A third one is to be of service. Now, worship, as you can probably tell, really fits that grow the soul phrase you hear a lot, because when we come in here, we're kind of breaking out of our familiar routines, and that allows your heart to kind of expand. And study actually does help us free the mind because, well, I'll get back to that in a moment, because without knowledge, our minds are literally imprisoned. And of course, service is a change the world part. But I want to go back to the study thing for just a moment. It's important because they're all connected. They're not just separate things. They all interlock, because when we do worship well, you learn something as well as feel something. I want to talk a little bit about Mr. Paul, who I read from a little bit ago. We're not very fond of Paul the Apostle. He had some particularly Luddite notions that we don't find comfortable in modern society. But what I like about him is that he's a real person. He's not a cardboard character who's been created out of scriptural perfection. He does have awful notions. He's also a very real human being. And it's in that same letter to the Corinthians that we have that fabulous passage about love being patient and kind. You may remember that he said in that same letter, "When I was a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child, and then as I grew up, I put away childish things." And I think that's a very good summary of what spiritual study should accomplish, even for people like us, because we continue to grow throughout life. At least one can hope. That's the grow the soul thing again, so that what we thought was true and reliable when we were 10 is not as reliable when we're 20, and maybe quite silly when we're 30. But that rarely makes us think that we should reevaluate our 30s when we're 40 or 50. We think we get up to a certain point and stay there for the rest of our lives, but you know that isn't true. That if we are true to our hearts, that our learning curve stays about as steep the whole way. So that when we get older, if we have been studying our lives and learning, we will have discovered that what we thought was true at 30 is no longer as valid as we thought, certainly when we're 40 or 50. So that's why when I am going to talk about service today, I'm going to talk about what we think it is and what we know it is not, because humility really is the fruit of study. We cannot know everything. We can know more, certainly, but we cannot know it all. And everything that I learn, I know, teaches me, again, how little I know. So let's turn with humility to the notion of service, because it's become such a cliche. We see service hours in schools now and how good it is to be of service. And I'm not disputing that even a little bit. There is Albert Schweitzer at the top of our order of service saying, "One thing I know, the only ones among you who will be really happy are those who will have sought and found out how to serve." I mentioned it earlier in the earlier service with William James, whose aphorism, "The secret to a meaningful life is to spend it on something larger than your own." So we all know what this service thing entails. But I think we need to go inside it a little more deeply to understand why it is still important and much more than a cliche. In Latin, the word for ministry is the same word for service, ministrare. I mention that because when you go to the hospital as a nurse or a physician, they minister to your needs. And when we run an organization, we administer that organization. And some places, governments do not have secretaries, but ministers of who serve. And people call me a minister, and I am called your senior minister, but you rarely hear me describe myself as a minister. Not because I don't serve, by no means. The great Pope of the 10th century, I think, maybe a little earlier, Gregory I, called Gregory the Great, signed his correspondences, Servus Servorum Dei, to the servant of the servants of God. So I understand that my job is to serve. What I am trying to say when I don't use the word minister is that that's not my title, that's our title. It is something that belongs to everyone. There's an old Baptist aphorism, and being an old Baptist church, we should probably know it. All are ministers, some are clergy. And the Quaker scholar Parker Palmer, whose work is always thrilling to read, left something in my brain I've never been able to get rid of. When someone asked him why it is that they have no ministers in the Quaker faith, he said, "We didn't abolish the clergy, we abolished the laity." So I wish us first to look at ministry as not something clergy do, but something people do. And when we do it with intentionality, and with study and with worship, it becomes something sacred. Of course, all religions teach that we should be of service. The wonderful Islamic scholar Sa'adi, whose affirmation we read this morning, says nothing else. And of course, if you look at the Hebrew prophets, all they are always saying is, if you think the ceremonies matter, they don't. If you think that station matters, it doesn't. All that matters is that you serve justice, love mercy, walk humbly with your God to serve the other people. So we all know this is the religious duty that we all have. And yet somehow we don't seem to do it quite so merrily, quite so thoroughly, quite so eagerly as the other parts of church, like going to church and singing the hymns and paying the pledges. And I think that's because the word service in our hearts, in our minds, still sounds demeaning, on bended knee, submitting, suborning, and somehow diminishing yourself. It's perhaps like being a maid or a servant. We don't want to be a servant, after all. We're free people. We serve no one. You call no man master. I am the master of my own soul. So we don't want to be self-reliant. We don't serve anything. Now let me tell you a story that harks back to last week. I think we all have experiences where we think of service as demeaning. In my very younger days, when I was maybe 7 years old, my mother had a cleaning woman. Anyone here want to fess up to having had a cleaning woman in your life? Well, of course. There's nothing wrong with that. I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area, and domestic help was largely, if not exclusively, done by people of color, black women. And being a young boy, I was not aware of the dynamics of racial anxiety. My mother loved to tell the story well into my adulthood, therefore to my eternal chagrin, of my coming home one day from school and announcing there was a new girl in our classroom that looked just like my sister, except that she was brown all over. She took this to be a sign of my moral freedom from racism. And yet, this blessed child that I was, untainted by race, remarked within earshot of the cleaning woman that she smelled bad. And this embarrassed my mother terribly. And I learned right then that that was something not to be shared. It was mortifying. And I associated it with her blackness, because none of the white people I knew smelled like that. Now, if you were here last week, and good for you if you were, you'll have to bear with me repeating something I said then, because just a couple of years ago, I read a book by Henry Louis Gates, Colored Folk, in which he recounts his own childhood when he was 7 or 8 years old, and his own grandmother who hated white people because they smelled so bad. And then realized at that moment as I read this that we don't learn much about ourselves until someone tells us what we don't want to hear. It may not be pleasant, and it may not even be hurtful intentionally, any more than my comment about our cleaning woman was meant intentionally to hurt, but that was a moment of spiritual learning. And I'm saying all of this story right now to remind us that we have these notions of service, that it is demeaning, that it belongs to people lower on the social structure, to people who are darker or smell different or who do not look us eye to eye.